were suppers that once sustained entire mountain communities across America. Yet if they were set on a dinner table today, many people would probably see them as meals born of desperation. A piece of cornbread that cost only a few cents, a pot of beans simmering from morning until night, a handful of wild greens gathered from the hillside, or a slice of salt pork cut so thin it almost seemed transparent in the glow of the fire. And yet it was these humble foods that carried thousands of Appalachian families through the years of the Great Depression. Simply having a hot supper to share was something to be deeply grateful for. This journey won't take you into grand kitchens or elegant dining rooms. Instead, it opens the door to a small wooden home in 1933, where every meal tells a story of resilience, family, and a quiet determination to hold on to dignity, even when there was scarcely a single coin left in a pocket. Opening the door to an Appalachian mountain kitchen, 1933. It was 1933, and dusk had just settled over the hills of eastern Kentucky. A cold wind slipped through the cracks in the old wooden walls, making a faded curtain flutter gently in the dim glow of an oil lamp. A few red coals still glowed inside the wood stove. A cast-iron pot rested slightly off-center above the fire, and from a ceiling beam hung a piece of fatback that had already been sliced thinner with every passing meal. In one corner of the kitchen sat a nearly empty sack of cornmeal, a few potatoes still dusted with soil, and a cast-iron skillet polished smooth from years of constant use. Father returned home after another day spent searching for work. Quietly, he brushed the red clay from his trouser legs before sitting close to the stove, holding out his frozen hands toward the fading warmth. Mother opened the paper sack and measured out enough cornmeal for supper, about 3 to 5 cents worth. She added a pinch of salt, poured in cold water, and mixed everything with hands roughened by years of hard work. "Tonight, we're having corn pone," she said softly. A small piece of bacon fat touched the hot skillet with a gentle sizzle. Within moments, the smell of warm cornmeal and wood smoke filled the tiny room. She shaped the dough into flat cakes, laid them onto the cast iron, and carefully turned each one when the edges began to brown. The fifth dish was corn pone. From the late 1800s through the years of the Great Depression, it was a familiar meal in countless poor Appalachian homes. Around 1933, a batch large enough to feed 5 or 6 people cost only about 5 to 8 cents if there was already cornmeal in the pantry. People broke off pieces to eat with stewed beans, wild greens, or dipped them into the dark pot liquor at the bottom of the bean pot, so the bread could soak up every bit of the rich, salty flavor from the fatback. Woodsmen tucked a few cakes into cloth bags before heading into the forest. Coal miners carried them deep underground. Children grew up with the smell of toasted cornmeal and the familiar sound of a cast-iron skillet each evening as darkness fell. A piece of corn pone never made anyone wealthy, but it was enough to keep hunger at bay for one more night. If kitchens like this remind you of your grandmother, your mother, or a simple meal from your own childhood, I'd love for you to subscribe and continue this journey with us. Beyond this humble piece of cornbread lie many more stories of people who survived hardship through quiet determination and an unwavering love for their families. Corn pone begins this story with nothing more than cornmeal and fire, but in an Appalachian kitchen, that was only the beginning. With little more than cornmeal, dried beans, and a thin slice of fatback, families created suppers strong enough to carry them through the hardest days they would ever face. And cornmeal was what kept the whole family going. There were afternoons when I watched Grandma open the bean jar and then glanced toward the sack of cornmeal resting beside the stove. It seemed as though all the hope for dinner was contained in those two simple things. She never needed to count how many dishes she could still prepare. As long as the cornmeal sack was not empty, there was still a handful of dried beans at the bottom of the jar. and a piece of fatback hung from the kitchen beam. The whole family would once again gather around the wooden table when night fell. In Appalachia was how many families survived their hardest years. This dish was called corn dodgers, a steadfast companion in the mountain kitchen. From around the 1860s through the 1930s, one skillet of these cakes cost only about 4 to 6 cents, made with nothing more than cornmeal, water, salt, and a little leftover fat. Grandma mixed the cornmeal with hot water, shaped it into long, slightly flattened rolls, and placed them on a cast-iron skillet set beside glowing coals. Once cooled, the cakes became firm and sturdy, easy to tuck into a cloth bag for a trip into the mountains or down into the mines. At mealtime, people crumbled them into a bowl of hot beans, allowing the bread to soften while keeping them full throughout a long day. Some dishes were created simply to help people endure the passing years. The third dish was southern beans and cornbread, the familiar supper of countless mountain families. Around 1932, 1 pound of pinto beans or navy beans cost about 5 to 7 cents, 3 to 5 cents worth of cornmeal, and 1 small slice of fatback, and the entire meal fed 6 people for a total cost of about 12 to 18 cents. The beans were soaked overnight and cooked slowly until tender. Fatback was added so its rich fat could melt into the pot, while dark golden cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet. At the table, everyone broke pieces of cornbread into a bowl before ladling the beans over the top, allowing the flavorful broth to soak into every crumb. The aroma of that meal stayed with many people for the rest of their lives. Dish was fatback, something far more valuable than its appearance suggested. Around 1930, a small piece cost only about 3 to 5 cents. Grandma would take the slab of fat down from the kitchen beam, slice it paper thin, and fry it in a skillet. The rendered fat was carefully saved to drizzle over vegetables and beans, or to grease the skillet before baking bread, while the crisp golden cracklings were broken into small pieces and shared among the children. Many evenings, the mere aroma of meat drifting through the pot was enough to make the kitchen feel warm. And from that sack of cornmeal and that single slice of fatback, the story of the corn harvests on the Appalachian mountainsides began to unfold. Dishes made from corn, humble but never bland. Whenever the corn harvest came to an end, I used to think the golden fields along the mountainsides had come to an end as well. But my grandmother always smiled, because she knew that while the harvest season might pass, corn would remain in the kitchen for many months afterward. Sacks of dried corn were stored against the wooden wall, several mature ears hung beneath the porch roof, and a jar of shelled kernels rested quietly on the shelf. For the people of Appalachia, corn never disappeared when summer ended. It simply found new ways to appear on the dinner table. Dried corn kernels were poured into a cast-iron pot, rattling against the bottom before being soaked in water mixed with wood ash, so their tough outer skins could gradually loosen. After being washed several times and simmered for many hours, each kernel swelled into a soft, plump white grain. This method had been passed down through many families in Tennessee, North Carolina. The surrounding mountain regions since the early 19th century learned from the Cherokee people. Around 1930, a pot of hominy made from purchased dried corn cost only about 6 to 10 cents, while families who grew their own corn needed little more than time and firewood. I still remember the steam rising slowly from the large pot, as though the entire afternoon had been exchanged for every spoonful of food. The dish was corn chowder, the soup of late summer days. Several mature ears of corn were cut from the cob, potatoes were peeled and diced, then cooked with onions and a little milk. If there was a bit of bacon fat left, Grandma would fry it until fragrant before stirring it into the pot, mixing everything until the potatoes became tender and the soup thickened. Around 1935, one pot large enough to feed 5 people usually cost only about 12 to 18 cents. The steam carried the sweet aroma of fresh corn throughout the kitchen, making it feel as though summer had lingered just outside the front porch. The 15th dish was creamed corn on toast. A slice of stale bread was toasted until warm, while corn was cooked with milk and a little flour before being spooned generously over the bread. Around 1942, the entire meal cost only about 15 to 20 cents, using 1 can of corn, a little milk, and a loaf of day-old bread. The creamy golden sauce slowly soaked into every dry crumb, transforming what might otherwise have been forgotten leftovers into a satisfying supper. Through those simple corn kernels, mountain people preserved the sweetness of one season to carry them into the next winter. And, when the pantry gradually grew emptier, many families turned their eyes toward the forests and the cold mountain streams. The next meal began with nature rather than the kitchen. The mountains became the poor man's marketplace. I still remember those winter afternoons when every pair of eyes in the house was fixed on the wooden front door. No one asked whether Father had found work that day. Everyone simply waited quietly to see what he might bring home from the forest beyond the mountain. If his hands were empty, more water would be added to the bean pot. If he carried a rabbit, a few squirrels, or a groundhog over his shoulder, the kitchen immediately came alive, knowing that meat would be part of dinner. Dish was groundhog stew. Around February of 1931, a single hunted groundhog could provide enough stew to feed the family for 1 or 2 days, while the extra ingredients that had to be purchased, such as potatoes, onions, a little fat, and flour, it cost only about 10 to 15 cents. The meat was carefully cleaned, soaked in salted water, cut into pieces, and browned before water was added, and everything was simmered for hours. Potatoes and onions gradually softened in the rising steam, making the stew seem to grow larger with every passing hour. People from the city might have found it unusual, but for families living on the mountainside, it was simply the meal that sent children to bed with warm, full stomachs. The 10th dish was called squirrel and dumplings. 2 or 3 small squirrels did not provide enough meat to divide evenly, so my grandmother always mixed flour and water into a simple dough, pinched off small dumplings, and dropped them into the broth. Around 1930, the entire pot usually cost only about 8 to 12 cents if the squirrels had been hunted in the woods. The dumplings became soft and fluffy, absorbing the rich flavor of the broth and making every bowl feel more substantial. There might have been very little meat, but its flavor spread through every bite of dough, enough for the whole family to eat slowly and feel a little lighter at heart. The 10th dish was rabbit fricassee. A wild rabbit hung beside the kitchen door before being lightly coated in flour and browned until golden around the edges. Then onions, broth, and a little milk were added, allowing the sauce to simmer until it became thick and creamy. During the early 1930s, this meal usually cost about 12 to 18 cents if the rabbit had been hunted in the forest. Pieces of cornbread were broken apart to soak up every last bit of sauce left on the plate. On those rare evenings, everyone ate more slowly than usual, as though trying to hold on to the memory of a meal that felt just a little more plentiful than the rest. The forest sustained countless families with whatever it was willing to give. But the story of the Appalachian kitchen did not end there. Beyond the woods lay cold streams, winding creeks, and dishes whose names might surprise outsiders. But for the mountain people, they were once the familiar flavors of everyday supper. Dishes that sound unusual today, but were once precious dinners. There are dishes whose names alone sound unfamiliar to people today. But I still remember my grandmother's calm expression whenever my father laid a possum, a turtle caught from the creek behind the house, or a string of freshly caught catfish on the table. She never looked surprised, nor did she hesitate. Her eyes immediately turned toward the basket of sweet potatoes, the sack of cornmeal, and the cooking fat beside the stove. In that house, anything brought home from the woods or the creek could become dinner. The 15th dish was possum and sweet potatoes. Between around 1928 and the early 1930s, if the possum had been hunted in the woods, the entire meal cost only about 10 to 20 cents, with the expense coming mainly from the sweet potatoes, salt, and the little sorghum molasses left in the jar. Meat was cleaned with great care, soaked in salted water, and arranged in a baking pan alongside the sweet potatoes. As the pan baked in the oven, the rendered fat from the meat dripped onto the potatoes, giving them a rich color and a sweet, savory aroma. For many mountain families, it was the kind of meal that made everyone feel they had been blessed with a fortunate day. The dish was called turtle soup with cornbread. Around the 1930s, a pot of turtle soup served with cornbread usually cost about 15 to 25 cents if the turtle had been caught in a nearby creek. Preparing the dish took much longer than most people would imagine. The turtle meat was carefully cleaned, cut into pieces, and simmered with onions and vegetables until the broth became deep and rich, while the cornbread baked separately in a cast iron skillet. The hot soup was ladled over freshly broken pieces of cornbread. Its aroma filled the room like a reward for an entire afternoon spent patiently tending the fire. The 18th dish was fried catfish and hush puppies. Around 1936, a fried catfish dinner for 6 people cost only about 12 to 18 cents if the fish had been caught from the creek near home. The catfish was coated in cornmeal before being lowered into hot cooking fat, while golden brown hush puppies floated beside it in the skillet. The cheerful sizzle of the frying oil, the aroma of chopped onions, and the crisp golden crust drew the children to the kitchen doorway before they even realized it. In those moments, poverty seemed to fade into the background, giving way to laughter around the dinner table. Forests and streams sustained countless families with whatever nature was willing to provide. Yet for the people of Appalachia, their greatest treasure often stood right in their own yard, where a single hog could provide fat, bones, meat, and enough food to keep the kitchen fire burning for many months afterward. A hog in the yard, and the philosophy of wasting nothing. I always knew hog butchering day had arrived long before I ever walked into the kitchen. The aroma of hot lard, mingled with wood smoke, drifted through every corner of the house. Steam fogged the window panes, and freshly sharpened knives lay across the wooden table. Adults worked almost non-stop throughout the day, quietly dividing every cut of meat, every bone, and every piece of fat, as though they were carefully arranging the entire winter into enamel basins. In that kitchen, a hog was never just a single meal. It was a promise that there would still be something to cook during the cold days ahead. The dish was pickled pig's feet and cornbread. Around 1930, if the pig's feet had already been saved from butchering day, the entire meal cost only about 8 to 12 cents for the vinegar, salt, and the cornmeal used to make the bread. The pig's feet were carefully cleaned, boiled until tender, and then packed into glass jars filled with vinegar and spices. At dinner time, Grandma would lift out a few pieces and place them beside hot cornbread freshly broken from the cast iron skillet. The bold tang of the pickled meat, paired with the fragrant cornbread, transformed what many considered an overlooked cut into a satisfying supper. The dish was called scrapple. After butchering day, scraps of meat, bones, skin, and the rich cooking broth were gathered together, simmered until tender. The meat was picked from the bones, finely chopped, and stirred together with cornmeal until the mixture became thick. Around 1932, one homemade loaf of scrapple usually cost about 15 to 25 cents if additional cornmeal and seasonings had to be purchased. The mixture was poured into a mold, left overnight to set, and sliced and fried in a cast iron skillet until crisp and golden on the outside. The cheerful sizzle of hot fat in the pan always brought the children into the kitchen earlier than usual. The dish was pork ribs with sauerkraut. Around 1938, Families who raised their own hogs and fermented their own cabbage needed to spend little more than the cost of a few seasonings and several potatoes. Ribs were first browned until fragrant, before being slowly cooked with sauerkraut, allowing the tangy cabbage to flavor the meat while the rendered fat mellowed every strand. The rich aroma filled the entire house, making winter evenings seem warmer than before. Every time I watched Grandma carefully scrape the last bits from the pot before covering the leftovers for the following day, I came to understand that true abundance often begins with appreciating even the smallest portion. Yet there were seasons when there was no hog left in the yard to wait for. During those times, the people of Appalachia returned to whatever grew along the hillsides, hung in the smokehouse, or rested quietly at the bottom of a jar of dried beans, where simple suppers continued carrying life forward one day at a time. Wild greens, dried beans, and the things hanging from the rafters, I used to think winter was the season when the kitchen would slowly run out of food, and I looked up at the smoke-darkened rafters and realized the adults had been preparing for it months in advance. Strings of dried beans swayed gently in the breeze. Bundles of herbs hung near the stove, and jars of seeds were neatly lined up on the wooden shelves. They were all messages sent from summer to the cold days ahead. The people of Appalachia did not wait until food became scarce before finding ways to manage. Prepared while the garden was still green and the forest was still full of life. Dish was leather breeches. Fresh green beans were threaded onto strings and hung beneath the porch roof to dry till they shriveled like old strips of leather. From the late 1800s through the 1930s, countless families relied on this method to preserve food for the winter. When it was time to cook them, the beans were soaked overnight before being simmered with water, salt, and a slice of fatback. If the beans had been grown in the family garden, the entire pot cost only about 5 to 8 cents. The lingering scent of wood smoke clinging to every bean allowed a winter supper to carry with it the memories of summers long gone. The dish was called wild greens mess. On early spring mornings, Grandma carried her old basket up the hillside to gather dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, and tender pokeweed shoots that she had learned to recognize many years before. Around 1932, the entire dish cost only about 2 to 4 cents for salt and a little cooking fat. The greens were carefully sorted, washed several times, boiled, and then sautéed to mellow their flavor. It began as a basket, overflowing with greens cooked down into a small dark green serving, enough to brighten the dinner table after weeks of eating nothing but dried foods. The dish was the ramp dinner. Small white ramps were pulled from the damp forest floor, filling the air with the sharp aroma of onions and garlic that clung to every hand. Around the 1930s, a meal served with potatoes, eggs, or cornbread cost only about 10 to 15 cents if the ramps had been gathered in the woods. Grandma carefully washed away the dirt, sliced both the bulbs and the leaves, and quickly sautéed them in a hot skillet. A rich aroma lingered on clothing throughout the kitchen and followed everyone for the rest of the day. For the mountain people, that unmistakable scent always announced that winter had finally begun to retreat. From the strings of beans hanging from the rafters, the baskets of wild greens, and the wild onions of early spring, the people of Appalachia learned to read the rhythm of the land and keep hope alive at the dinner table. When even harder seasons arrived for the whole community, every little kitchen opened its doors, contributing its ingredients to great pots large enough to warm an entire neighborhood. Community meals, one pot could feed an entire neighborhood. There were afternoons, smoke rose not from a single chimney, but drifted in a long ribbon across the yard in front of the little church at the foot of the mountain. I still remember the enormous cast-iron pot resting on 3 stones above a bed of glowing firewood, while neighbors quietly arrived carrying whatever they could spare. A handful of beans, a few potatoes, an old hen, a meaty soup bone. or the last ears of corn from the season. Once everything found its way into the same pot, everyone knew that no one would have to eat alone that night. The dish was burgoo. It's around 1935, one large pot prepared in Kentucky, and the surrounding Appalachian region cost about $1 to $3 altogether. Each family contributed only a few cents or whatever ingredients they already had. Chicken, rabbit, pork, or squirrel was simmered until tender before potatoes, corn, lima beans, tomatoes, and onions were added one by one. One of the men stood stirring the pot with a large wooden paddle while fragrant steam drifted across the entire yard. Once the stew was served, no one could tell which ingredients had come from which family, but everyone recognized the flavor of generosity and shared kindness. The dish was called Victory Garden Soup. Between 1942 and 1945, many families planted vegetable gardens behind their homes to help feed themselves. A pot of soup made from tomatoes, beans, yellow squash, potatoes, and carrots usually cost only about 10 to 20 cents if the vegetables had been grown at home. The vegetables were roughly chopped and added to the pot one after another. The potatoes gave the broth more body, the tomatoes added a gentle tartness, and if there happened to be a soup bone available, it had been simmering since morning to deepen the flavor. The aroma of cooked vegetables filling the kitchen always brought a peaceful feeling that was difficult to put into words. The dish was Hoover stew, a humble meal associated with the years of unemployment and hardship between 1931 and 1933. Potatoes, onions, cabbage, a few bones, inexpensive macaroni, whatever cooking fat remained were all added to the same pot, creating a meal that cost about 15 to 25 cents. It was never a fixed recipe because every family cooked with whatever happened to be left in the kitchen. Every warm spoonful carried the quiet hope that tomorrow there would still be enough strength to keep going. From those shared pots, people preserved far more than a single evening meal. They preserved the belief that when hardship arrived, there would always be another hand ready to add something to the pot. And after those humble suppers had ended, mothers still tried to save one small treat for their children, a little sweetness, to bring a long day of worries to a gentle close. Humble desserts, finding a little sweetness even without money. After the bowls of beans had been emptied, and the last piece of cornbread had been broken in half, the grandmother would often stand quietly before the old wooden shelf, as though something was still unfinished. There was hardly any sugar left in the jar, and the fruit basket had been empty for quite some time, but she always managed to find something gently sweet to place in the middle of the table. It took me many years to understand that dessert in a poor mountain kitchen was never a luxury. It was the grown-ups' way of telling the children that life still held a few gentle moments worth waiting for. The dish was apple stack cake. Dating back to the 19th century, this many-layered cake had long been a tradition at Appalachian weddings. Around 1930, a large cake cost between 50 cents and $1, if you counted the flour, dried apples, and molasses. Each cake layer was baked separately, while the dried apples were cooked until soft and spread between every layer. After resting overnight, the apple filling soaked into the cake, creating a deep, comforting aroma unlike any other. People often said that every wedding guest brought a single cake layer, so even a poor bride and groom could have a wedding cake tall enough for their special day. The dish was persimmon bread. Wild persimmons were gathered after the season's first frost, when their bitterness had finally given way to sweetness. Around 1937, the loaf cost only about 10 to 18 cents, using flour, a little sugar, and whatever spices remained in the pantry. The ripe persimmons were mashed into a smooth pulp, mixed into the batter, and baked slowly until the kitchen filled with the scent of autumn. Each slice was soft, moist, and warm with a rich brown-orange color that somehow made the whole room feel cozier on a cold day. There were also mock apple pie and vinegar pie, two desserts born during the hardest years of scarcity. Between 1933 and 1942, the cracker pie that stood in for apple pie cost around 20 to 30 cents, while the vinegar pie cost only 15 to 25 cents. Mothers carefully arranged crackers inside a pie shell, cooked sugar syrup with cinnamon, or whisked vinegar with sugar to create a pleasantly sweet and tangy filling. The children still smiled as they held a slice in their hands, because what they remembered was never the ingredients. It was simply the feeling that every supper still ended with a little sweetness reserved just for them. Those humble pies and cakes brought supper to a close with love rather than abundance. And as our story draws near its end, we return to what quietly stood at the heart of almost every Appalachian kitchen: a pot of hot beans, a piece of cornbread, and the last bit of pot liquor, still fragrant with fatback at the bottom of the pot, where the true spirit of an age shaped by hardship remained. The night has grown late, and the fire in the stove has almost burned out. Yet those humble kitchens still live on in the memories of countless people. Some of these dishes disappeared as life gradually became easier, but the stories behind them are still worth remembering. If you enjoy simple memories like these, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together we'll continue opening the doors to forgotten kitchens, where every meal tells a small piece of history.